You think you're stuck because progress feels slow. That's your first mistake. You've been poisoned by instant gratification, by highlight reels, by weak men pretending success happens overnight. So when you actually start improving, quietly, painfully, daily, you panic. Why am I not there yet? Because you're still thinking like a spectator, not a builder. Real progress is invisible at first. It's supposed to feel slow. If it felt fast, everyone would be powerful, and they're not. Most people are average, soft, and replaceable. You're uncomfortable because you're finally doing something real. Let me break your illusion. You don't lack progress. You lack the ability to recognize it. You're measuring growth with the wrong lens. You expect dramatic transformation, some cinematic glow-up, some overnight dominance. That's fantasy. Reality is repetition. Reality is boring. Reality is showing up when your emotions are dead and your motivation is gone. You're not behind, you're just not dramatic enough to impress your own weak expectations. That's the truth you don't want to hear. And here's where it gets deeper. What you call slow progress is actually you learning a new internal language. Most men don't even understand this. I call it speaking in tongues. Not some mystical nonsense, but the language of transformation. When you start leveling up, your old identity can't understand your new actions. You feel disconnected, confused, like you're speaking a different language to yourself. That's not failure, that's evolution. Weak men run from that feeling. Strong men lean into it. Because when you're building discipline, you're not just changing habits, you're rewriting who you are. And identity doesn't shift overnight. It fights back, it resists. Your mind tries to drag you back to comfort, to familiarity, to weakness. That tension you feel? That's the war between your old self and your future self. And most people lose that war because they interpret discomfort as a sign to quit. That's why they stay average forever. You want dominance? Then understand this. Control isn't emotional, it's mechanical. You don't wait to feel powerful. You execute, you repeat, you build systems that don't care about your feelings. Every day you show up, even when it feels pointless, you're stacking bricks. You don't see the building yet, so you think nothing is happening. Wrong. The foundation is being laid, and foundations are invisible. That's why weak people quit. They need applause to continue. You need results. The real shift happens when you stop chasing visible progress and start respecting invisible growth. When your standards rise, when your excuses disappear, when your discipline becomes automatic, that's when you've crossed into a different league. You're no longer trying to improve. You become someone who improves. That's the identity shift. That's the language change. That's speaking in tongues at the highest level, operating on a frequency most men will never reach because they quit too early. So if progress feels slow, good. That means you're finally doing it right. Fast progress is fragile. Slow progress is unbreakable. The question isn't, why is this taking so long? The real question is, are you strong enough to keep going without validation? Because if you need proof every day, you're not built for power. Power requires patience. Power requires silence. Power requires you to trust the process when there's nothing to show for it yet. You think something is wrong because it feels slow. That's the first trap. You've been conditioned to expect speed, stimulation, and constant feedback. So the moment your progress becomes quiet, repetitive, and uneventful, your brain panics and labels it as failure. But what you're experiencing isn't failure, it's reality. Real work is not exciting. Real work is not cinematic. It doesn't give you daily rewards or visible transformation. It gives you friction, resistance, and long stretches where nothing seems to change. That discomfort you feel is not a warning sign, it's proof that you've stepped out of the illusion. The illusion is fast results, easy wins, and overnight success. The illusion is what weak men chase because it feels good in the moment. But anything that comes quickly disappears just as fast. When progress is slow, it forces you to build something deeper than surface-level results. It forces you to develop patience, control, and the ability to operate without emotional payoff. Most people fail right there, not because they lack ability, but because they lack tolerance for boredom. You need to understand that repetition is not the enemy. It's the entire system. The same actions done daily, with no variation, no excitement, and no applause. That's where transformation actually happens. You don't rise because you had one powerful day. You rise because you executed the same standard over and over again until it became automatic. And automation is where power lives. When your discipline no longer depends on how you feel, you become dangerous. But that level of control is built in silence, not in moments of hype. You're also making a critical mistake by measuring progress externally. You look for visible changes, results you can point at, outcomes you can show. But the most important changes happen internally first. Your standards shift. Your tolerance for excuses disappears. Your focus sharpens. You start rejecting distractions that once controlled you. None of this is visible at the beginning, so you assume nothing is happening. That's your ignorance, not reality. Internal change always comes before external results, and it always takes longer than you expect. There's also a psychological resistance you're not accounting for. Your mind is wired to keep you in familiar territory. When you start improving, even slightly, your brain pushes back. It creates doubt, boredom, and frustration to pull you back into comfort. And because progress is slow, that resistance feels stronger than the results you're chasing. This is where most people quit. They interpret resistance as a sign they're going the wrong way, when in fact it's proof they're moving forward. If you can't handle slow progress, you'll never build anything that lasts. Speed creates fragility. Slow, consistent execution builds resilience. Every day you show up and do the work without excitement, you're strengthening something far more valuable than results. You're strengthening your identity. You're becoming someone who executes regardless of emotion. And once that identity is locked in, results are no longer a question of if, but when. So the next time it feels slow, understand what's actually happening. You're in the phase where most people collapse. You're in the part of the process that filters out the weak. There is no applause here, no validation, no visible proof. Just you, your standards, and your ability to keep going without needing anything in return. That's not a problem. That's the process. You're not stuck. You're addicted. Addicted to visible proof, to immediate feedback, to something you can point at and say, look, it's working. And when that proof doesn't show up fast enough, you assume nothing is happening. That's not logic, that's conditioning. You've trained your mind to only respect what it can see, while ignoring the far more important work happening beneath the surface. Here's the uncomfortable reality. The most valuable progress you will ever make is invisible in the beginning. No applause, no recognition, no external validation. Just quiet, repetitive effort that doesn't look impressive to anyone watching. And that's exactly why most people never get anywhere. They refuse to operate without being seen. They need confirmation. They need reassurance. They need something to justify the effort. Without it, they lose interest. This is where the separation happens. Weak individuals perform when there's an audience. They push harder when someone is watching, when results are noticeable, when the reward is immediate. But the moment that visibility disappears, so does their discipline. Strong individuals operate differently. They don't need proof. They don't need attention. They execute because that's who they are, not because someone is observing. You've been measuring progress like a spectator instead of a builder. Spectators look for highlights, big wins, dramatic changes, obvious results. Builders focus on inputs, daily actions, controlled behaviors, systems that compound over time. The problem is, inputs are boring. They don't give you the emotional satisfaction you're used to. So you start questioning the process, not because it's ineffective, but because it's not entertaining. There's also a deeper issue. You've tied your sense of progress to external outcomes. If the result isn't visible, you feel like you're wasting time. That mindset will destroy you, because real growth doesn't announce itself early. It builds quietly, layer by layer, until one day it becomes undeniable. But that moment only comes to those who are willing to work without seeing it first. Think about what's actually happening when you show up consistently without visible results. You're training your mind to detach from outcomes. You're building a level of discipline that isn't dependent on rewards. You're proving to yourself that you can operate in uncertainty. That's a different level of control. Most people never reach it because they quit the moment the results aren't immediate. And let's be honest, you don't really want progress. You want confirmation. You want something to validate that your effort is worth it. But that need for validation is exactly what's holding you back, because it makes your consistency conditional. You'll work hard as long as you see results. The moment those results slow down, your effort drops. That's not discipline, that's negotiation with your own weakness. The individuals who dominate in any field understand something you don't, yet they trust the process before it pays them. They respect the unseen phase. They know that what looks like nothing to the outside world is actually everything. It's the foundation. It's the system being built. And once that system is strong enough, results don't just appear, they multiply. If you can't operate without visible progress, you'll always stay dependent on it. And anything you're dependent on controls you. That means your work ethic is not yours, it belongs to your results. When results are good, you feel strong. When results are slow, you feel weak. That's not power. That's instability. So the real issue isn't that you're stuck. The issue is that you haven't developed the ability to work in silence, to trust effort without evidence, to continue without confirmation. Until you fix that, you'll keep starting strong and quitting early, over and over again, convincing yourself that the problem is the process, when the problem is your need to see it working immediately. Something feels off inside you, and you're interpreting it as a problem. That's your mistake. That tension, that confusion, that sense of not fully recognizing yourself anymore, that's not dysfunction, that's transition. You're not breaking down, you're breaking away. And most people misread that moment completely. They think something is wrong because it doesn't feel comfortable, stable, or familiar. But growth has never been comfortable, and it has never asked for your permission. You're in the phase where your old identity is losing control, but your new one hasn't fully taken over yet. That gap creates friction. You start questioning your decisions, your habits, your direction. You feel like you're in between versions of yourself, no longer satisfied with who you were, but not yet fully aligned with who you're becoming. That in-between state is where most people panic. They retreat. They go back to what feels known, even if it's weak, because at least it's predictable. What you're experiencing is internal resistance at the identity level, not surface-level discomfort, not simple lack of motivation. This is deeper. Your patterns, your habits, your beliefs have been built over years of repetition. Now you're trying to override them with new standard, new behaviors, new expectations. That doesn't happen smoothly. It creates conflict. And your mind will do everything it can to pull you back into the old version because it's efficient, familiar, and requires less effort. This is where most people sabotage themselves without realizing it. They start strong, they push through initial resistance, but the moment this identity conflict appears, they interpret it as burnout or misalignment. They tell themselves, maybe this isn't for me, or maybe I'm forcing it. No, you're not forcing it. You're confronting it. You're challenging a version of yourself that has been in control for too long. Of course it's going to fight back. The discomfort you feel is a sign that your standards are rising. You're no longer tolerating the same excuses, the same distractions, the same weak behaviors. But those habits don't disappear instantly. They linger. They tempt you. They try to pull you back into old routines, and when you resist them, it creates internal pressure. That pressure is not a signal to stop, it's a signal that the change is working. You also need to understand that identity is not built through intention, it's built through repetition. You don't become a disciplined person because you decided to. You become disciplined because you act that way consistently, even when it feels unnatural. At the beginning, everything feels forced. You're going against your default settings. But with enough repetition, what once felt foreign becomes automatic. That's when the shift locks in. Right now, you're speaking a different internal language. Your old self doesn't understand your new standards. Your new self rejects your old habits. That clash creates confusion, but it's necessary. It means you're no longer aligned with weakness. You're outgrowing it. And growth always comes with a period of instability before it stabilizes at a higher level. Most people never push through this phase. They retreat the moment things feel uncertain. They go back to behaviors that require less effort, less discipline, less control. And then they wonder why nothing changes. It's because they never allowed the identity shift to complete. They interrupted it halfway and returned to what was comfortable. If you stay in this phase long enough, if you continue executing despite the discomfort, despite the confusion, despite the lack of clarity, something changes. The resistance weakens. The new behaviors feel more natural. The internal conflict starts to fade. And eventually, the version of you that once felt unfamiliar becomes your default. But that only happens if you don't run from the discomfort, if you don't misinterpret it, if you don't let it convince you to stop. Because what feels like chaos right now is actually structure being rebuilt at a higher level. And most people will never experience that, not because they can't, but because they quit the moment it stops feeling easy. You keep waiting to feel ready. That's the flaw. You've tied action to emotion, and now you're stuck negotiating with a system that was never designed to lead. Feelings are unstable, inconsistent, and easily influenced. One bad night, one distraction, one moment of doubt, and your entire plan collapses. Then you tell yourself you'll start again when you feel better. That's not discipline. That's dependency. Discipline doesn't operate on emotion. It operates on instruction. You decide what needs to be done, and then you do it, regardless of how you feel about it. That's what makes it mechanical. There's no debate, no internal discussion, no hesitation. The task exists, and your job is to execute. When you remove emotion from the equation, you eliminate the weakest variable in your entire system. Most people never reach this level because they're addicted to motivation. They need a reason, a spark, a surge of energy to begin. And when that energy disappears, as it always does, they stop. Their productivity rises and falls with their mood. That's not control, that's volatility. You can't build anything stable on something that unstable. If your output depends on how you feel, then you don't control your life, your emotions do. The shift happens when you stop asking yourself, do I feel like doing this? And replace it with, is this required? That question changes everything. Because once something is required, your feelings become irrelevant. You don't debate necessities. You don't negotiate with obligations. You execute them. That's how high-level performers operate. They don't wait for alignment, they enforce it. At the beginning, this approach feels unnatural. You're used to following impulses, chasing comfort, avoiding resistance. So when you start acting without emotional support, it feels cold, rigid, even uncomfortable. That's exactly why it works. You're breaking the pattern of emotional decision-making and replacing it with structured behavior. You're building a system that doesn't collapse under pressure. Repetition is what turns this into power. The first time you act without feeling like it, it feels forced. The second time, slightly less. Over time, it becomes normal. Eventually, it becomes automatic. That's when discipline stops being something you try to do and becomes something you are. And once it reaches that level, your consistency becomes unbreakable. You no longer rely on motivation because you remove the need for it entirely. There's also a level of self-respect attached to this. Every time you follow through on something you said you would do, especially when you don't feel like it, you reinforce trust in yourself. You prove that your word has weight, that your standards mean something. Most people can't say that. They make promises to themselves and break them daily, then wonder why they lack confidence. Confidence isn't built through positive thinking. It's built through evidence, through consistent execution. When you operate mechanically, you also remove hesitation. You don't waste time overthinking, doubting, or waiting for the perfect moment. You move immediately. That speed of execution compounds over time. While others are stuck in analysis, waiting for the right feeling, you've already completed the task and moved on to the next. That's how you gain an advantage without increasing effort by eliminating delay. This doesn't mean you become robotic or lose awareness. It means you prioritize structure over impulse. You decide in advance what your standards are, and then you follow them without exception. That consistency builds momentum, and momentum creates results that no amount of short-term motivation can match. Most people will never adopt this because it requires letting go of comfort. It requires acting when it's inconvenient, when it's boring, when it's difficult. But that's exactly what separates those who stay average from those who take control. Because once your actions are no longer tied to your feelings, nothing can stop you except your own decision to quit. Everyone wants rapid progress until they experience the consequences of it. Fast results look impressive on the surface: quick gains, sudden breakthroughs, immediate recognition. But what most people fail to understand is that speed often comes at the cost of stability. When something grows too quickly without depth, it becomes fragile. It looks strong, but it hasn't been tested. It hasn't been reinforced. And the moment pressure is applied, it cracks. Slow progress doesn't have that weakness. It builds underneath the surface first. It forces you to develop structure before expansion. While others chase visible results, you're reinforcing the foundation, your habits, your discipline, your standards. That process is not exciting. It doesn't give you immediate rewards. But it creates something far more valuable than short-term success. It creates durability. Think about what happens when you earn progress slowly. Every step requires effort. Every improvement demands repetition. You don't skip stages. You don't bypass difficulty. You don't rely on shortcuts. That means every layer of your growth is tested before you move forward. You're not guessing, you're proving. And that proof builds confidence that isn't based on outcomes, but on capability. Fast progress often hides weaknesses. When things move too quickly, you don't have time to identify gaps in your system. You don't notice where your discipline is inconsistent, where your focus breaks, where your habits are unstable. Everything feels like it's working until it suddenly isn't. And when it collapses, you don't know why, because you never took the time to understand what was holding it up in the first place. Slow progress removes that risk. It exposes every weakness early. It forces you to confront limitations while they're still small and manageable. That's uncomfortable because it means you can't hide behind momentum. You have to deal with reality step by step. But that's exactly what makes the end result stronger. Nothing is left unaddressed. Nothing is built on assumption. There's also a psychological advantage that most people overlook. When you build slowly, you develop patience. Not passive waiting, but controlled persistence. You learn how to operate without immediate reward. You become comfortable with delayed gratification. That alone puts you ahead of the majority, because most people can't tolerate waiting. They need quick validation to stay engaged. Without it, they lose focus and move on. Slow progress also rewires your expectations. You stop looking for shortcuts. You stop chasing easy wins. You start respecting the process instead of trying to bypass it. That shift changes how you approach everything. You no longer ask, how fast can I get this? You ask, how solid can I build this? And that question leads to completely different decisions. When your foundation is strong, pressure doesn't break you, it sharpens you. Challenges don't expose weakness, they activate strength you've already developed. That's the difference. You're not reacting in the moment. You're responding from preparation. Every repetition, every controlled step, every disciplined action has already trained you for it. Most people never experience this level of resilience because they're too focused on speed. They want results before they're ready to handle them. They build without structure, expand without control, and then wonder why everything falls apart when things get difficult. It's not bad luck, it's weak construction. When you take the slower path, you eliminate that risk. You build something that doesn't depend on conditions to survive. Your progress doesn't disappear under pressure because it was never rushed. It was earned, reinforced, and tested over time. At that point, you don't just have results, you have something that can hold those results permanently. And that's where real power exists. Not in how fast you rise, but in how impossible it becomes to fall. You keep asking why it feels slow, as if the timeline owes you an explanation. That question itself is the problem. It exposes a mindset that's still dependent on speed, still chasing comfort, still expecting progress to match your expectations instead of reality. The real issue isn't the pace, it's your tolerance. You haven't built the capacity to continue without reassurance, without visible proof, without constant feedback telling you're on the right track. Endurance is the trait you're missing, and without it, nothing you start will ever reach completion. You'll begin with intensity, push hard for a short period, and then fade the moment things become uncertain. Not because you're incapable, but because you haven't trained yourself to operate in that space where effort is required, but results are delayed. That gap between action and reward is where most people collapse. You've been conditioned to expect immediate returns. You put in effort. You expect to see something. When that transaction doesn't happen quickly, your mind starts negotiating. It questions the process, doubts the direction, looks for alternatives. And before you know it, you've shifted focus or stopped entirely. Not because the path was wrong, but because your patience was weak. If you rely validation to continue, you've already lost control. Because validation is external, unpredictable, and inconsistent. Some days you'll see progress, some days you won't. Some days you'll feel confident. Other days you'll feel stuck. If your consistency depends on those fluctuations, then your output will always be unstable. An unstable effort never produces strong results. The individuals who reach the top operate differently. They don't wait for confirmation. They don't wait constant signs that things are working. They understand that progress compounds quietly. They trust that what they're building today will show up later, even if there's no immediate evidence. That trust is not blind, it's built through discipline. Through repeated execution in the absence of reward. You need to separate effort from emotion and results from expectation. Your job is to execute, not to feel good about it, not to see instant outcomes, not to constantly evaluate whether it's working. Execution is the only variable you fully control. Everything else operates on a delay, and if you can't handle that delay, you'll never experience the full return. There's also a harsh truth you need to face. Most people don't actually want long-term success. They want short-term satisfaction that looks like success. They want quick wins they can show, temporary results they can feel proud of. But when it comes to sustained effort without recognition, they disappear. That's why so few people reach a high level. Not because it's impossible, but because it requires a level of endurance most are unwilling to develop. Endurance is built the same way everything else is built, through exposure. You put yourself in situations where results are delayed and you continue anyway. You resist the urge to quit, to switch, to seek something easier. You stay locked into the process long enough for it to pay off. And every time you do that, your tolerance increases. What once felt slow starts to feel normal. What once felt uncertain starts to feel controlled. When you reach that point, everything changes. You're no longer chasing progress, you're accumulating it, quietly, consistently, without needing to see it every day. You become immune to the emotional swings that stop everyone else. While they're starting and stopping, you're moving forward without interruption. That's the real question you need to answer. Not why it's slow, but whether you're capable of continuing anyway. Because if you're not, then it doesn't matter how good the opportunity is, how clear the path is, or how strong your potential is. You'll always fall short. Not because you couldn't do it, but because you wouldn't last long enough to see it happen. You don't need motivation. You need obedience to your own standards. You don't need reassurance. You need endurance. And you definitely don't need speed. You need consistency that doesn't break under pressure. So stop whining about how slow it feels. That's the price of becoming someone dangerous. Either you accept it and keep moving, or you quit and go back to being average like everyone else. Your move.